Okay, be honest for a second. When was the last time you genuinely enjoyed a Pirates of the Caribbean movie after the third one? And I mean truly sat down, got pulled into the world, and felt that same excitement you had back when Jack Sparrow first swaggered onto the screen in 2003. For many of us, the answer is a sheepish shrug. Because let's face it, after At World's End, the franchise didn't just start sinking, it lost its compass entirely. And not the cool, magical one Jack carries that doesn't point north. No, I'm talking about the creative compass. It's as if the franchise set sail on an infinite loop of cursed objects, ghost captains, and aimless treasure hunts that no longer meant anything. It started feeling less like an epic high-seas adventure and more like watching your favorite rock band go on yet another comeback tour, playing to nostalgia, but with none of the magic that made them great in the first place. Ever found yourself asking, wait, how many of these movies are there again? Or, why are we still doing this? You're not alone. Today, we're diving deep into why the Pirates of the Caribbean series should have gracefully bowed out after the third film, and how pushing the franchise beyond its natural ending didn't just water down the stories, but actually hurt the legacy of some of the most iconic characters ever created by Disney. So grab your your metaphorical spyglass, and stick with me, because some of the behind-the-scenes reasons for this cinematic shipwreck are going to surprise you. Let's rewind to where it all began. The original trilogy, The Curse of the Black Pearl, Dead Man's Chest, and At World's End, told a full, emotionally satisfying story. It had everything: cursed treasure, vengeful ghost pirates, romantic tension, betrayal, political intrigue, and a surprising amount of emotional depth. We watched Will Turner go from a humble blacksmith to the immortal captain of the Flying Dutchman. Elizabeth Swann evolved from a governor's daughter into a fearless pirate queen. And Jack Sparrow, he was the wild card, unpredictable, morally ambiguous, but always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. That's what made him fun. That's what made him work. The trilogy had stakes, it had character growth, it had a narrative arc that, despite all the fantasy and chaos, was actually deeply human. So when At World's End wrapped up with Will sailing into eternity, Elizabeth watching from the shore, and Jack setting out on his next misadventure, it felt like an ending. A real one, not a cliffhanger, not a sequel hook, just an ending. So what happened? Enter on stranger tides. Suddenly, the story veered off into what felt like uncharted and uninspired waters. Gone were the emotionally compelling arcs of Will and Elizabeth. Gone were the rich political subplots involving the East India Trading Company. In their place, a plot about the fountain of youth that somehow managed to feel both overcomplicated and hollow at the same time. Jack Sparrow, once a cunning trickster with a heart buried beneath layers of rum and sarcasm, had become a caricature of himself. He wasn't outwitting anyone anymore. He was stumbling through the plot like a theme park animatronic that had glitched halfway through a performance. The charm was gone. The wit was forced. The stakes? What were they again? Oh, right. Something about mermaids. And Blackbeard. And a chalice. And a map. And honestly, I had already checked out by then. The problem is, when you take a character like Jack Sparrow and remove the strong ensemble around him, the grounding force of Will's seriousness, Elizabeth's fire, even Barbossa's gravitas. What you're left with is chaos without contrast. Jack works best because he's not the center of gravity. He's the tornado that spins around the core. But when you make him the core, everything collapses into absurdity. Think about it. In The Curse of the Black Pearl, we first meet Jack in one of the greatest introductions ever, standing proudly on a sinking ship, stepping onto the dock just as it disappears beneath the waves. Iconic, clever, visually funny, but thematically rich. That was a metaphor for Jack himself, always on the brink of disaster but somehow staying afloat. But in the later films, he's just drunk, just stumbling, just there for comedic relief that doesn't really land anymore. The nuance? Gone, and let's talk about the tone. The original trilogy had this masterful balance: swashbuckling adventure, dark fantasy, romance, comedy. The world felt dangerous and mystical, but also full of life. From the eerie depths of Davy Jones's locker to the swirling maelstrom. Battle in At World's End, everything had weight. There was grandeur, there was vision. But the sequels? The scale was still there, the CGI was bigger than ever. But the soul was missing. It was all surface. Big battles with no emotion. Monsters with no meaning, villains with no real motivations. Do you even remember the name of the villain in Dead Men Tell No Tales? It's okay if you don't. Most people don't. And that's part of the problem. When your antagonist is more forgettable than the background extras in Tortuga, you've got a problem. And speaking of forgettable, can we talk about the plots of the later movies? Because wow, they were like trying to follow a treasure map drawn by someone spinning in circles. First, it's the Fountain of Youth. Then it's the Trident of Poseidon. Then it's Jack's magical compass, which for some reason can now summon a ghost fleet if you abandon it? Since when? The continuity got murkier than the waters of Isla de Muerta. Each movie felt like it was throwing spaghetti at the wall, hoping something, anything, would stick. And it never did. Every film introduced a new mythological object that somehow held the key to saving or dooming the world, but none of it felt earned. None of it felt connected. It was like fan fiction with a budget. Even the actors seemed to know something was off. Keira Knightley and Orlando Bloom, arguably two of the biggest anchors of the original trilogy, skipped on. Stranger Tides entirely. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a conscious decision. And while they did make a small cameo in Dead Men Tell No Tales, it felt more like an obligatory nod than a real return. Johnny Depp himself even commented in interviews that the later stories were less focused and lost some of the heart. When your lead actor, who is the face of the franchise, is publicly admitting that the story's gone adrift, maybe it's time to raise the white flag. But perhaps the most telling sign that the series overstayed its welcome is how the audience responded. The Rotten Tomatoes scores paint a clear picture. The first film, 80%. A beloved classic, the second and third, still respectable, sitting in the 60-70% range. But then the drop-off hits. On Stranger Tides, a dismal 33%. Dead Men Tell No Tales, even worse. Critics describe them as bloated, soulless, confusing, and uninspired. And fans? They started voting with their wallets. Sure, the later films made money, but not the kind of box office phenomenon the original trilogy generated. The cultural impact shrank. The merchandise slowed. The Halloween costumes faded. People moved on. And yet, Disney didn't, because here's the thing. When a franchise makes billions, the temptation to keep squeezing it dry is too strong. Even if the creative well has run dry, the financial incentives keep the ship sailing. But just because you can make another sequel doesn't mean you should. In storytelling, knowing when to end is as important as how you start. The Pirates franchise had the chance to go out on a high note, to leave behind a near-perfect trilogy that would be remembered as one of the greatest modern fantasy sagas. Instead, it chose to drift into mediocrity, chasing bigger effects, new characters, and diminishing returns. The original Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy did something few film franchises managed to accomplish. It struck a delicate balance between character development, spectacle, and thematic depth. It told a coherent story that had a natural conclusion. Jack Sparrow wasn't just comic relief, he was layered, unpredictable, and walked the line between hero and rogue. Will Turner went from blacksmith to cursed captain in a journey filled with sacrifice and honor. Elizabeth Swann evolved from a governor's daughter into a commanding pirate queen, every film built on the last, escalating both the stakes and the emotional resonance. The conclusion in At World's End felt final, epic, and most importantly, satisfying. So when the fourth installment, On Stranger Tides, was announced, many fans were curious but also wary. What story was left to tell? That was the first sign of trouble. No one really had a good answer. Without the core trio fully intact and without a driving emotional arc, On Stranger Tides relied on gimmicks and disconnected plot devices to push the narrative forward. It didn't feel like a continuation. It felt like a rehash. Worse, it seemed like the film didn't understand what made the original trilogy work in the first place. The story revolved around the Fountain of Youth, a mythic MacGuffin that lacked the emotional and thematic weight of the previous goals, like breaking curses, saving loved ones, or confronting one's destiny. And while Jack Sparrow was still front and center, his character no longer had any real depth. He was there to stumble around, toss off a few zingers, and provide comic relief, not to grow or change or confront any kind of meaningful conflict. It was around this point that the franchise began to feel more like a theme park ride than a compelling narrative. Ironically, that's where it started, as a ride. But what made the first 3 films special was how they transcended that. Origin, building something cinematic and substantial from what could have been simple popcorn fare. The later films did the opposite. They leaned into the spectacle but forgot the soul. They traded intricate character arcs for shallow character types. They swapped emotional moments for big action set pieces. And they sacrificed storytelling. For box office bait, one of the most telling moments of creative fatigue came in the casting decisions and performances. With Will and Elizabeth out of the picture in On Stranger Tides, the filmmakers attempted to replicate their dynamic with new characters, Philip and Serena, but their subplot was underdeveloped and lacked the chemistry and gravitas that Bloom and Knightley brought to the originals. Even the inclusion of Blackbeard, a legendary pirate figure, felt underwhelming, more like ticking a checkbox than introducing a truly memorable villain. Ian McShane did what he could with the role, but the writing didn't give him much room to create the kind of menace or tragic complexity that made Davy Jones so compelling. When Dead Men Tell No Tales arrived, it was clear the formula hadn't changed. More lore, more trinkets with magical powers, more new characters introduced, as if they could recapture the original magic. We were introduced to Henry Turner, Will's son, and Karina Smith, who was later revealed to be Barbossa's daughter. These twists might have worked in a better script, but here they felt tacked on, like afterthoughts designed to evoke nostalgia rather than add something meaningful. And the movie's attempt to bring back Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley in cameos only underscored how much their presence had been missed in the previous installments. Then there's the visual side of things. Sure, the effects were dazzling. Ghost sharks, crumbling ships, oceanic vortexes. But they were loud, relentless, and ultimately hollow. They lacked the storytelling discipline of the original trilogy's action sequences, which felt earned and grounded in character choices. Take the whirlpool battle in At World's End, for example. It wasn't just an effects showcase. It was a culmination of emotional arcs, betrayals, sacrifices, and high-stakes decisions. In contrast, the later battles felt like noise. There were no consequences, no tension, just pixels and chaos. Meanwhile, Jack Sparrow, once the unpredictable heart of the story, became a shadow of himself. Depp's performance turned into a caricature, and whether that was due to writing, direction, or actor fatigue, the result was the same. A character that had once redefined what a movie anti-hero could be now felt like a tired punchline. Instead of surprising us with clever maneuvers and unexpected wisdom, he became a bumbling fool who seemed to exist purely for slapstick and recycled one-liners. It was painful to watch someone who once stole the screen with a raised eyebrow and a mumbled insult reduced to a shallow parody. The franchise's creative decline wasn't just about characters or story either. It became visible in how it treated its own legacy. Rather than build organically from what came before, each new installment seemed desperate to introduce bigger lore, new magical rules, and increasingly convoluted backstories. The Trident of Poseidon, for example, was meant to be a game-changer, but its existence raised more questions than it answered. If such a powerful object existed all along, where was it during the events of the original trilogy? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it? The more the franchise expanded, the more it unraveled its own internal logic. There's a reason some of the best stories ever told, whether in literature, television, or film, know how to end. There's power in closure. A well-timed finale can elevate everything that came before it. But overstaying a story's welcome often has the opposite effect. It diminishes what made it special. That's what happened with Pirates of the Caribbean. Rather than let the trilogy stand tall as a singular achievement in blockbuster storytelling, Disney chose to keep going. And with each new film, the magic faded a little more. The legacy got blurrier, the emotional resonance became harder to feel, and yet, The franchise still made money. That's the cruel irony. As long as the box office receipts came in, even if they shrank each time, there was still incentive to push forward. But success at the box office doesn't always equal success in storytelling. A billion-dollar film can still be creatively bankrupt. And that's where the Pirates franchise found itself, adrift in a sea of excess, trying to recapture a spark that had long since burned out. What could have been a tight, powerful trilogy remembered for its originality and heart became a cautionary tale, a lesson in why more isn't always better, because sometimes the most daring thing a studio can do is stop, not because the audience is gone or the money's dried up, but because the story has run its course. Because it's better to end on a high note than to fade away in mediocrity. What's especially tragic is that the Pirates universe had so much potential. Side characters like Tia Dalma, Barbossa, even Davy Jones could have supported spin-offs or deeper lore exploration, if handled with care. But instead of exploring those avenues thoughtfully, the franchise opted to repeat the same formula over and over. Treasure, villain, curse, ghosts, cue Jack Sparrow stumbling in with a one-liner, rinse, repeat. So now I've got to ask you, seriously, which Pirates of the Caribbean movie do you think should have been the last? Was At World's End your final stop? Or did you find something redeeming in the sequels that kept you coming back for more? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand. And hey, no judgment if you're Team Dead Men Tell No Tales. Well, maybe just a little judgment. If you enjoyed this deep dive into franchise fatigue and cinematic legacy, then you'll definitely want to check out our video on movie franchises that went too far. Trust me, it's like a support group for fans who've been burned one too many times. And if this video made you laugh, nod in agreement, or just scream, "Yes, exactly!" at your screen, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and don't forget to ring that bell. We've got more film deep dives coming that'll make you rethink everything you thought you knew about your favorite movies. Thanks so much for watching, and always remember, sometimes it's better to sail off into the sunset with your dignity intact than to keep floating around in circles long after the wind's gone still. Stay curious, my friends, and I'll see you in the next one.